Hello and welcome to this week's adventure on Searching for Reality. This is now week 2, where we're going to continue our study of early natural philosophy. These would be the pre-Socratic philosophers. Pre-Socratic in the sense of these individuals working up to the time of Socrates. They bear no direct relationship to Socrates other than being early physicists and biologists and astronomers out trying to study the world, trying to come up with a hypothesis as to how reality functioned, what was real, what was not real, what was being and non-being. So we're going to continue on. Last week we spoke about Thales and his notion of a single substance. This week we're going to take the idea of a single substance and essentially push it further, because we'll be speaking more in metaphysical terms, which, as I mentioned last week, we are metaphysical beings. We're constantly trying to construct a bridge from our world into some other metaphysical world where the world that we can see is explained to us with either laws of nature, predictable movements, these kinds of things. This is what these natural philosophers were concerned with. So at this point now, we're looking at a kind of a metaphysical view of the world. It's what's called a metaphysical puzzle, if you wish. And the ancient Greeks, the Athenians, those from the Eleatic school that we're talking about, those from Elia, these particular philosophers, again, they didn't call themselves that, but these scientists will say, we're trying to understand the world from this metaphysical point of view. And they were trying more than anything else to account for change. How do things change? What is it about the world that makes it so dynamic? Crops can come into being and flourish and die away and come back the next year. The movement of water, tides that recede, that ebb and flow. The world was full of dynamic movement. And these early natural philosophers wished to understand why. Why was this happening? So the world clearly was dynamic. It was self-moving, and a whole range of things were being noticed. Water could evaporate, right? Fire could turn wood into ash. Creatures came into being and died away, including ourselves. Bodies decomposed. And all of these dynamic, ever-changing aspects and these elements of reality caused these thinkers to sit down and try to devise some way of explaining why that was so. So essentially, that's what they were trying to do. So the ancient Greeks believed that the world had always existed. It had always existed with no starting point. The proverbial, it is what it is. Well, in this case with the ancient Greeks, it truly was a matter of things were the way they had always been. So the world had always existed. Since before the dawn of rewritten history, who knows? But it had always existed. So the origins of existence, what many years later involved things like the Big Bang Theory, or even the development of species, these issues were not on the table for the ancient Greeks. They were more concerned with change they could see. So the origin of the world, the origin of existence was not a clearly defined problem at this early time. And Democritus, whom we're going to see later on, even he is an atomic theorist, and the early formulations about atomic theory. Now, this is not atomic power, but simply the notion that atoms exist, the notion that tiny particles come together and form things. Even Democritus did not worry about this being an issue in the sense that, where do these atoms come from? They've always been here. So Democritus, and then several hundred years later, Epicurus, who's also an atomist, said essentially the same thing. These things have always existed. The issue is not their origins. The issue is, how do they change? What makes these particular things change? Now, Heraclitus, who is an early philosopher / natural philosopher, living around 1540, so certainly almost 100 years before Plato, that we'll talk about next week. Heraclitus was somewhat of a mystic. He also was someone that felt himself separate from the crowd, felt himself blessed in some way of being able to understand the world as it truly was. Now, it caused him so much grief that by the end of his life, he was literally living in a barn covered in shit and not willing to interact with anybody. Excuse my French, but Heraclitus essentially lost his mind trying to understand the world. But at this early point, Heraclitus is hugely abstract in his writings, abstract in his thinking, almost mystical in this particular thinking. And he was less concerned with reason than he was with using the senses to make sense of the world. And his main idea was to argue that reality, the world that we see in front of us, is in constant flux. Now, I'll just not read a lot of them, but just a few fragments from Heraclitus, just to give you an idea of the way he was thinking. On universal flux, for example, fragment 20, everything flows and nothing abides. Everything gives way and nothing stays fixed. Now, section 17, he also says, nature loves to hide. So he was aware that there were certain things that we may never understand, but nature will yield up enough for us to hypothesize as to what's going on. He also was very careful to identify the kinds of minds, the kinds of intellects that could understand the world in the way he did. Fragment 10, he writes, to be temperate is the greatest virtue. Wisdom consists in speaking and acting the truth, giving heed to the nature of things. So he was someone that wished to step back and let the world unfold in order for him to understand it. He was not about to impart an understanding and say, this reality I see must fit this module, must fit this theory, this paradigm. No, it was the other way around. So he wished for the world to come into being on its own terms and for him to understand it. So Heraclitus was a remarkable philosopher, remarkable also in the way in which he would write these almost cryptic statements about the earth, about the human soul, about intellect. For example, he would say, this is fragment 46, a dry soul is wisest and best. Or it's also known as the best and wisest soul is a dry beam of light. And what that means is that when a soul is dry, in other words, it is clear, it is almost transparent. Compare that to what he would call a moist soul. When you think of moist, when people get drunk, for example, and they don't think straight, and they hypothesize about all kinds of things, what Heraclitus was talking about here was a clear, rational, lucid sentiment, an intellect that could see clearly. So an intellect that could see clearly was a dry intellect, was a dry soul, more so than one sodden with alcohol or sodden with anything else. So that is sort of Heraclitus in a nutshell, sort of some ideas that he presented. But he was certainly a mystic because his ideas don't yield explanation very easily. And he wrote like this on purpose because he thought, okay, if I am an intellect, I'm going to write my ideas in such an intellectually rigorous manner that it's going to take a certain degree of intelligence to even make sense of what I'm saying and then to unpack it correctly. So as you can imagine, Heraclitus was not mainstream thinking. He was not hugely popular. And the reason for that was because of the way in which he presented his ideas. His inquiry was of one certain kind, using the senses, but his method of presentation was entirely different. These statements are almost cryptic. They need to be unpacked almost word by word, and then sort of reformulated differently until finally the idea comes into being in our own minds. So he was opposed to observation as a method because we needed to engage our intellect. As he said, it does not teach understanding simply to observe, because we need to do more than observe. We need to think and reflect in order for us to come to an understanding of reality. Now, what Heraclitus did was, compared to last week when we talked about a single substance, Heraclitus had his single idea. And his was this notion of flux. And the substance for him was fire. Fire to him was the kind of flux that he was talking about. So it wasn't water, same sort of idea that we would have with Thales. No, here, fire is not something that's tangible. We can see fire, but we cannot hold it. But it is a substance that qualifies literally the world around us. Now, we need to unpack this a little bit more carefully. So, the world of fire which is constant change. If you look at a bonfire or even any kind of fire, it's constantly changing. Its intensity, its shape, its colors. But there it is. We see it, and yet we can put our hand through it. Don't recommend it, but you can. But it is constantly changing. And it's not really a thing, is it? It's not a substance. It is the result of substances that come together, whether it's an explosion, whether it's combustible gases. So it's this unique image, it's a unique metaphor that Heraclitus was able to bring to our attention, which is this notion of fire. And what he wished to talk about was fire as a kind of process, because fire consumes things and makes one thing into another. So if you wish to speak about change, which was the main concern for the second group of thinkers from the Eleatic school, these individuals were concerned with process. How does something change? And Heraclitus says, change is it. It's not how does it become change. It is change. That is the underlying substance. So the rational principle, right, or what they would call logos. Logos is also Greek for word, but the logos is what governs the universe. So everything constantly changes. Now, that is not a slippery slope, but it's very unsteady ground to now build a foundation, an intellectual foundation, when someone like Heraclitus comes along and says, everything is in flux. Everything is constantly changing. Now, in this day and age, in our rapidly changing world, we can abide by this idea. We can see, yeah, Heraclitus may have been correct all along. But the point is, in order for us to understand a process, how something changes, is consumed by something else and becomes a new thing, for Heraclitus, change was that thing. It wasn't the result of it. It was the thing itself. So this is what makes Heraclitus' thinking quite remarkable. So the idea of picking a fundamental substance, earth, air, fire, water, or so on, he is keeping with this tradition, but because he picks something like fire, fire is one of these unusual substances. Like I say, it is an intangible thing, yet we can see it. It's like a shadow. Seeing a shadow on a wall. You can see it, but you can't touch it or hold it, and yet there it is. Or even the shadow of smoke. There it is doubled up. So smoke in and of itself you can't see, or certainly cannot hold it. You can see it. But a shadow of smoke is, again, something more and more ephemeral. And yet Heraclitus was saying exactly that. Behind and informing the world around us, the reality we could see was this all-moving, all-changing dynamic element called fire. So it begs the question here, right? If all is flux and constant change, how could there be a static underlying substance? So how can something be permanent if we're talking about fire, which is constant flux? Well, there is the issue. We're talking metaphorically. We're speaking here metaphysically, hypothetically. And Heraclitus, in fact, is creating an analogy, right? The constant movement and changing and shifting shape of fire is the constant moving change of reality itself. So it is change itself that is fundamental, not the things that are changing. So fire only survives with fuel, but it is not able to sustain itself without other elements around it. And that is how Heraclitus can reconcile this notion of fire in and of itself and fire in relation to other elements. So it needs certain constituencies and certain characteristics to come into being. We'll see very shortly the notion of love and strife. Heraclitus had a very similar idea that movements will come together in love and then come apart in strife or struggle. So the notion of the movement away as a kind of struggle and then a movement coming back as a kind of harmony or love is something that is consistent with Heraclitus and others in the Eleatic school. So we'll take a look at that. Now, another very important early thinker who is essentially the opposite, we'll say, of Heraclitus is Parmenides. And Parmenides was living roughly around the same time, 1540, and he argued that nothing could be anything other than what it actually is, or could ever change. So here is this odd idea that everything that is. Remember, I mentioned that at the beginning that Greeks were not concerned with the origins of things. So Parmenides is probably one of the best examples of someone thinking along the same lines, saying, look, everything is, and everything that is not does not exist and cannot exist. Now, let's take this further, because Parmenides is arguing that nothing could be anything that what it actually is, or was teleologically designed to be, and could never change. There is only the one which is this sort of globe or scope or environment in which everything lives within it. Here, for example, I just want to read some things. Now, this is this particular book, the Pre-Socratics, excellent book. This is Parmenides talking about the way of truth, right? Come then, listen to my word and take heed of it. I will tell you of the two roads of inquiry which offer themselves in the mind. The one way that it is and cannot not be is the way of credibility based on truth. The other way, that it is not and that not being must be, cannot be grasped by the mind, for you cannot know not being and cannot express it. So this notion of being and non-being is very important to Parmenides, because things that don't exist cannot come into being. Because if everything has always already existed, things can only all belong to one universal entity, one universal whole, or what he calls the one. And now, not only that, but the fact that things cannot be moved or changed in this same way. He talks, for example, here in a fragment, moreover, reality, it is immovable, held so in mighty bonds, and it is without beginning and end, because both creation and destruction have been driven away by true belief. Remaining always the same and in the same place by itself, it stays fixed where it is. For strong necessity holds it in bonds of limits, which constrain it on all sides. Natural law forbids that being should be other than perfectly complete. It stands in need of nothing, for it is, if it needed anything at all, it would need everything. So let's unpack this statement just very briefly. He says, strong necessity holds it in bonds of limit. In other words, everything necessarily has to exist. There has to be a relational balance between all the aspects and elements of the universe that he calls the one. So, strong necessity holds it in bonds of limits and constraint on all sides. So there is equal balance all the way through this one, this globe, this entity, whatever you want to call it. The aspects and elements within it are in perfect balance with one another. And he says natural law forbids that being should be other than perfectly complete. There's no such thing as something that is incomplete. It always has been forever complete. Now, the other really important aspect with Parmenides is how he relates thought as part of this unity, this one. And he writes, thinking and the object of thought are the same thing, for you will not find thought apart from being, nor either of them apart from utterance. Indeed, there is not anything at all apart from being, because fate has bound it together so as to be whole and immovable. Accordingly, all the visual notions that mortals accept and rely on as true, coming to be and perishing, being and non-being, change of place, and variegated shades of color, are nothing more than names. So the important aspect of this statement here is that thinking and the object of thought is the same. We exist in that bubble with thought. So we are the embodiment of thought, our being, the world around us. And finally, at the very end here, he says very clearly, thought and being are the same thing. So keep that statement in mind as we move further along. So there is things that have always existed. Things that don't exist cannot exist. Thought and being are together as one unity, as one part of this element that he's created, where there is basically no exterior. We are all inside this one. Now, this kind of thinking only happens a couple more times in the history of philosophy. Spinoza, who we'll look at in a couple of months, comes up with the same idea where we have this unity of the world, right? The world self-creating, and God essentially stands on the outer edges of this universe, of this one. And then we have again Marx, who writes in the 1800s, looking at the world in a similar way, but here he's finding that things are not in balance. There is this interaction of all kinds of levels of society, political structures, human nature, human existence, being. All these things are interconnected, absolutely, but they're not in balance. There is an imbalance. And if Parmenides is correct to state that thought and being are the same, then how do we deal with reason that points out contradictions? So this is something Parmenides didn't think through all the way, and it took until the 1800s and someone like Marx to say, yes, there are clearly contradictions in this bubble we live in. We'll call it that, the one. So keep that in mind as we move through the history of philosophy. Some of these early thinkers reveal profound thoughts, and they lay the foundation for revisions later on. So whether it is Spinoza and this totality of the world, or Marx and other individuals who look at the world in a similar kind of totality, a concrete totality, but with contradictions, not with perfect balance. So far from it. So Parmenides, to get back to his work, he argues that there is only the one, right? There is only one entity that has existed forever, and that change, the change that Heraclitus talks about, is simply an illusion. Heraclitus believed that the eyes are better sense data gatherers than the ears, for example, but he still believed that sense data was the beginning of understanding. What Parmenides is saying is essentially the opposite, that the very change that Heraclitus uses as a foundation for his thinking, it is an illusion. Whatever our senses tell us is in fact incorrect. So this kind of thinking puts him in contradiction with Heraclitus. Now, what is actually happening here? Heraclitus is claiming that everything is change. Everything is flux. Everything is constant movement. There is nothing stable. Nothing abides. And Parmenides comes along and says, no, absolutely the opposite. That change that we see is not the foundation of reality. It is an effect of reality. That change is an illusion, because behind it is something that is fundamentally there all the time. Being. Existence. And existence informs everything we see. The natural world, the human world certainly, but being. Being is what informs, in a sense we could say, what glues reality together. So Heraclitus says the glue is constantly shifting and changing. And Parmenides says no. What is constant is not change, but stability. And stability he defines as being. So when we look at both of these, Heraclitus and Parmenides are metaphysicians, we'll say. They deal with metaphysical ideas, and they are very abstract, and they are hypotheses, but they're exactly the opposite. One says change, the other says stability or permanence. So Heraclitus, of course, change, Parmenides, stability and eternal being and so on. This is the way in which these two individuals living very close to one another in terms of time were saying. So they are literally coming to opposite conclusions about these metaphysical issues that are being raised by the natural philosophers. So change is either all there is and can't be reduced to any other phenomena, or that it is all an illusion and we do not require any other explanations. It is what it is because being exists forever. So what is happening here is we're beginning to see the development of these two paths that we're going to see throughout the history of philosophy as we search for reality, which is a rational or a Parmenidean view of the world and an empirical or Heraclitian view of the world. So let's unpack this idea here as well, because here we are in week 2. We haven't even gotten to Plato yet, who is an ancient philosopher, and already it's probably confusing. But let's sort of carry on slowly and understand carefully what is being discussed here. So we have Heraclitus and Parmenides, who have theories that conflict with observation, in the sense that Heraclitus looks with his own eyes and sees that there is change, constant change. Things come into being and fall away and perish. Parmenides says, yeah, but that's not what matters. What matters is what's going on behind. An eternal being is what matters. That's your single substance, not change, what's behind it, which is being. So that is essentially what they are arguing. So these ideas, these theories and hypotheses are clearly the product of metaphysical thinking, because both are using the world as they see it and moving in opposite directions. One saying stability, Parmenides, the other saying change, Heraclitus. So the view that reason is superior to our senses, in other words, the Parmenidean view of the world, is called rationalism or rationality. And this is the fundamental distinction between Parmenides and Heraclitus. We have Parmenides being one of the very first rationalists because he is using reason to understand and fathom out the world. Heraclitus is using his senses, empirical data, to construct his ideas. So let's look more carefully what these two terms actually mean. So empiricism, or what Heraclitus is doing, is a theory that all knowledge is derived from sense experience. And we will see this come up time and again, where we have philosophers that are going to travel down one road or another, the either rational one or the empirical one. Now, that's not to say that the empiricists don't use rationality. They clearly do. But it's the way in which they combine these two to come up with an understanding of reality that makes their conclusions quite different. So empiricism, the basis of the theory of empiricism is that knowledge is derived from sense experience. So that is to be contrasted with rationality, which is a theory that reason, not sense experience. In other words, the experience that I have looking at the world with my eyes, listening with my ears, touching with my hands, and so on, I use that as the basis for understanding. That is not how Parmenides works, and that is not how rationalism works. Instead, reason, the mind engaging with the world and looking for these metaphysical bridges into another world, a metaphysical world of laws and organized chaos in certain cases. So that is the difference between these two fundamental points of view. So rationality is using reason as the foundation of certainty in knowledge. So we can look at it this way as well, right? Empiricism here, which would be Heraclitus. Knowledge is derived from experience, experimentation. Scientific data is derived primarily from empiricism. That is not to say that they don't use reason, but it is primarily sense data and sense experimentation. Experimental sciences, those become the paradigm of knowledge, because if you say something, other people should be able to understand it, because it needs to be consistent. It needs to be able to, I'm going to grab my other book here. For something to work, right, something needs to be reasonable if you expect it to be communicable. In other words, explained to other people. It needs to be coherent. It needs to be logically sound and reasonable. And finally, it must be demonstrable. In other words, you can show other people what you mean. And empiricism essentially works with that. So it is a way to understand the world, or in this case, reality as we search for it. It's a way of understanding the world through experimenting and experimentation, continually experimenting, trying the same thing over and over again to get the same result. and if there's a deviation, trying to understand why. Secondly, science is the paradigm of knowledge. This is the paradigm that's being sadly contested by an awful lot of individuals who seem to think they know better, whether they're anti-vaxxers or something else, but I don't want to digress. But until recently, we'll say experimental science has been the paradigm of knowledge. And finally, that experimental science cannot produce certainty, but it can produce enough data that to warrant further testing, which in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, experimental sciences have never come out to explain, not explain, but to claim certainty. Each time we have looked at the data as it stood, let's say back in April, we thought it was a certain kind of a virus. Then 2 months later, everyone changed and said, okay, we know more about it. It does this. Everyone was concerned about washing their hands. And now all of a sudden, just wear a mask. Maybe it doesn't live on surfaces as long. Well, it is as a result of continual experimentation that we have been able to come up with some reasonable understanding of this pandemic and this virus and how it operates. Now, sure enough, the most recent scientific data is telling us that this virus is mutating. So it may now be conditional to other aspects of reality, other ways of communicating or this disease being communicable. So at no point does empiricism claim absolute knowledge. Now, compare that to rationalism that believes that it can, because it says that no, here, rather than the senses, knowledge is derived from reason and logic. So you can be reasonable and logical, and if the parts fit together, likely it's true. And of course, instead of the experimental sciences, mathematics and geometry, for example, those are the paradigms of knowledge, because it is either right or wrong. There's no conditional sense in mathematics. It is right or it is not. So genuine knowledge, it is not likely, it is allegedly certain, because it is rational, not empirical. In other words, somebody who is a rationalist is going to believe in absolute knowledge, while someone who's an empiricist believes in a certain degree of certainty, or a certain amount of certainty, sorry for being wordy here, but there is the notion that we can go further. We can understand more information. We just need to carry on. So if we go back to Parmenides and Heraclitus, clearly Parmenides did not trust our senses. He believed that the eyes and the ears were being deceived, that this change that Heraclitus spoke about was simply an illusion. And instead, the world was actually part of this unified, unchanging, never developing or whatever, infinite, right? Always existed one. And it cannot be subdivided, modified, changed in any way. It is what it is. And we live within it. Our being partakes in it. Our thoughts partake in it. We are connected with the world around us. Now, from an environmental point of view, that's a lovely statement, because people might respect the environment a bit more if we realize, oh, yeah, remember Parmenides told us about, 2,500 years ago that we are part of nature. We don't live separately from it. So Parmenides' idea does have a certain validity, this notion that we are living in this one. Now, is it unchanging and infinite? That's debatable, because more recently, within the last, let's say, 50 years, we have discovered things like the Big Bang Theory, that the universe develops at a certain point and then it begins to contract. And again, these are all hypotheses. These are not confirmed facts. These are based on data all collected over a long period of time, saying that certain things do change. There is some stability in other areas of the universe, but not everywhere. So the notion of it being unchanging and infinite, that's debatable. But being unified and us participating in it, that's something that is worth considering, because it is to a certain degree correct. So when we speak of Parmenides, appearances can be deceiving, right? What appears in front of us may be deceiving. Now remember, it was Heraclitus who said, nature loves to hide. Parmenides, in a sense, takes it further, and he says, well, nature does hide its true essence, which is being, eternal, unchanging being. So it is a very abstract way of looking at the world, not based on empirical data, but certainly starts from empirical data and moves to a higher level. And well, depending, some people will say slavishly acknowledging it, but at least moving to a second level to say, here is the true reality. Now, we will see Plato do something very similar next week when he talks about perfect forms and ideas being unchanging and forever there versus sort of some corrupted, motley, dying away version of the material world that we see in front of us. So Parmenides sort of sets a foundation for Platonic thought, this notion that what we see in front of us is a corrupt, inferior version of something that exists elsewhere in its pure form. So the reasoning for Parmenides is certainly worth considering, because he argued that what we cannot know or think about doesn't exist. Right? We cannot know or think about what does not exist, because the moment we do, it must exist somewhere, right? Even if it exists in thought. I can imagine a unicorn that farts rainbows. Fantastic. Well, there it is. Maybe it exists somewhere, just in my head and in my goofy imagination. But Parmenides was arguing, he was completely serious when he said this, we cannot know or think about something that does not exist. Because as soon as we do, it already exists on some level, and it exists in our minds. So it's at least somewhere. So what exists cannot have come into being. If this is so, it must have not existed at some point. And that doesn't make logical sense. Remember, rationality uses reason and especially logic. So here's a very logical statement. What exists cannot have come into being. In other words, it needs to have existed forever, infinitely. So what exists cannot have come into being, because if that is so, then it means it must have not existed at some point. And that's the part that is inconceivable. We cannot have something that does not exist and suddenly come into being. We cannot explain that. So if that is the case, if what exists were to change, then it must have become something it currently is not. So that, to Parmenides, is also inconceivable, as they say in Princess Bride. It's inconceivable, but not to Heraclitus. Because remember, this is exactly Heraclitus's main idea, that things currently or constantly come in and out of being. They are destroyed through fire and come back as something else. So Parmenides believes that everything that is, and everything that is not, cannot exist, which is difficult, but here we are in 540 BC, and already these natural philosophers, but metaphysicians at the same time, are thinking in the most abstract kind of ways, but coming up with these very profound statements. What exists cannot have come into being. Greeks believed that everything existed forever. Therefore, you couldn't hold that thought in your head. But if something were to change, it had to be something that it was not before. And that also is very difficult to think about. So for Parmenides, it's fairly straightforward. What is not cannot ever be. And what is cannot not be. What exists has to have always existed. And what does not exist cannot exist. It cannot come into being magically. It cannot suddenly just appear out of nowhere. Just a particular configuration of substances suddenly create this thing. Okay, so if that's the case, what we think is changing is in fact an illusion. Because with change, like Heraclitus believes, change requires the ending of something and the beginning of something else. Something comes into being and something perishes. And out of the perishing of that thing, something else comes into being. Parmenides believed that was wrong. That was impossible. So change is an illusion for him. Now, Empedocles, who lived a little bit sooner, closer to us, in other words, came after Parmenides and Heraclitus, sorry about that. Empedocles comes along and tries to, as we'll see with Plato, with Kant, some philosophers come along at a certain time and try to take these two opposing ideas and find the common ground between them. And Empedocles is exactly one of these kinds of thinkers. And yet he was a metaphysician. He certainly was considered a pre-Socratic. He was a natural philosopher, but he was already a metaphysician, right? Already building that bridge into this other world of natural laws and measurable and verifiable change. So his kind of metaphysics still returns to this notion of an element, a single element possibly, but at least an elemental view of the world. And he was known as a Milesian philosopher, and Empedocles believed that there wasn't just one element, right? The philosophers from this area thought that there were four elements, and those four elements came together or moved apart according to what they would call love or strife. So Empedocles is combining Heraclitus' notion of things coming together and drifting apart, or coming to be and then perishing. Now, love is, of course, the coming to be and stability, and strife is this pulling away, this sort of consumption by fire. So Empedocles tries to reconcile these two tendencies. On the one hand, the tendency of finding a single element. He says, well, there's more than one. There's in fact four: earth, air, fire, and water. But what does happen is we can understand change by the way in which they come together, love, or they perish, strife. And so these were, for Empedocles, the principles of creation and destruction. So this is essentially what he was trying to tell us. So we can see here this kind of, again, a cosmic cycle, metaphysical cycle, you want to call it. What is happening here is we have the presence of life where we have a contention or a battle between things held together and things being pulled apart. So as they are pulled in one area, life is not present because life is not settled down into something. It's in conflict. It's in turmoil. It's undergoing strife. It is not congealed into something. So we start with an initial contention, right, between these two forces of togetherness, love, pulling apart, strife. It moves into this pure domain of just battle, right? This is a kind of imbalance of nature, and it's a pure domain of just strife and chaos. Eventually, as these things settle and love is able to reconcile these various elements into a particular shape, into a particular group of substances, right? Earth, air, fire, and water. There is now contention between strife and love. And there we have the presence of life. So at the very top, which would be right here and here, we have stability right there, or love. Across here, right, we have strife on this side and love on the other side. Now, in this particular case, what is happening is as these two forces are struggling with and against each other, we end up with forces that bring things together in love and pull things apart in strife. So this is Empedocles' cosmic cycle. Again, a hypothesis, because these are metaphysical ideas. These are ideas that are created in order for us to understand the world as it presently is. And clearly, we still know the four elements of earth, air, fire, and water. We do. But we are obviously much further along, scientifically speaking, in understanding the world. But at this early time, remember, no telescopes, no microscopes, no gear, no scientific equipment of any sort. This is simply watching the senses, right? Empirical data. So the metaphysical picture does become a little bit more complex because instead of one single substance, we have four, right? Water, fire, air, and earth. And these particular elements, these four elements, come together in various configurations. More or less water, more or less air, more or less earth. And those forces that are acted upon these four elements, those forces are called principles of attraction or love, or principles of repulsion or struggle or strife. And so the idea of forces already is metaphysical. The notion of the four elements is that's empirical. So see how Empedocles has been able to look at these two ideas and say, well, can we reconcile these two things? And essentially that's what he does. He's able to do or in a sense, take the best of both. From Heraclitus, he takes a notion of elements. Heraclitus looked at just fire. So Empedocles takes it further and says, no, we have actually four of them. So there's the Heraclitean school satisfied, but then the Parmenidean school, which is the notion of forces. Now remember, forces with Parmenides were in perfect balance all the time forever. Wouldn't that be nice? But it isn't. So those forces were in perfect balance with Parmenides. Empedocles says, well, there are forces and there are balances, but they are actually principles of attraction and repulsion. So see how he's taken these two fields, right? These two areas, and the empirical view of the four elements, the rational view of these forces that we cannot see. We cannot touch them and quantify them, but we can see them in action. And those are those principles of action and repulsion, or attraction and repulsion. So that is how Empedocles is able to, in a sense, reconcile, or at least combine these two thinkers together. So the natural world for Empedocles is comprised of these four elements, right? Of earth, air, fire, and water. And the way in which the world is created, or that reality is constituted, is by the forces of attraction and repulsion that act on these four elements. So we have a coming together, which Heraclitus would certainly agree with, and then a coming apart, which is something that also Heraclitus would believe in, but the Parmenideans would have also been saying, yes, okay, I see how the forces kind of marry up with what we were talking about this balance, or balance of forces in nature. Well, they're not balanced. They are forces indeed, but these forces both repel and attract those elements. So that's how we're able to reconcile these particular ideas. So Empedocles believes that the universe started out with these elements in perfect harmony, perfect balance, and essentially inert. In other words, not moving, not changing, not struggling, not in any kind of strife. And so that is the beginning of the world. Now, it's in fact the opposite of the Big Bang Theory. Now again, some people don't believe that the Big Bang Theory occurred. It's entirely up to you. The point is, at this early stage, when the world comes into being, everything's in perfect balance. So there's Parmenides' world acknowledged, right? Everything's in perfect balance. But then things begin to change, right? And the universe starts to change when those elements that were combined and still or unmoving or inert, strife slowly starts pulling them apart, right? Pulling them apart from their unity. And the world, the material world that we see, is the result of this constant movement between strife or struggle or battle of some sort and love, which is things being brought back together again. Think of a weed that grows on a city street, in a sidewalk. That struggle that seed had to undergo to find a single crack in the sidewalk, to be able to crawl out through. And again, dramatic or not, it's remarkable to see a piece of concrete with just a slightest little crack in it, and out comes a weed. That is Empedocles. The fact that there was strife and struggle for this tiny little weed to find that single little space between two chunks of concrete to pop up from out of the ground and grow and live. So think of it that way. Now imagine Empedocles seeing the world as these four elements all lined up, uniquely situated, with perfect balance between them. Something happens. That's something we're not sure about, because Empedocles does not give us an explanation as to what starts the strife, but strife is what begins to change the world. What begins to alter the structure of the world from one into another. And what does happen is strife does eventually predominate, because it is now the source, the engine of change. So strife predominates. The world is somewhat chaotic as things begin to settle, and it could take thousands of years for the world to be constituted in a particular way. But eventually, that chaos and strife does ebb away and perish, and the element of love and stability now predominates. So this model is two-stage, love and strife. This is an eternal system. It's also a symmetrical system. So if we wish to look at, the Parmenidean school is still out on Empedocles, but can you give us something, that's going to be on our side? And what Empedocles says is, look, it's eternal and it's symmetrical. So if you want your perfect balance, I'll meet you halfway, which is essentially what he does. He meets the Parmenidean school about halfway by saying, look, this struggle and or the forces of stability and attraction, those are the things that are eternal and symmetrical. They come into being, they perish. They come into being again, they perish. So that is how Empedocles is, again, able to reconcile the various thoughts that are being presented. Now, the last person we're going to look at is Democritus and atomic theory. Democritus is writing in around 1460 BC, and he also comes up with a remarkable idea, which is the notion that, remember those four elements? He's reduced it back down to one. Surprise. Okay, and what is that one element? This thing called, what the Greeks would call atom. An atom means uncuttable. In other words, the smallest, tiniest thing that you could find in the world. And I imagine Democritus with a very sharp knife, with a piece of maybe cobalt or a piece of sort of black soot of some sort, and on a very clear, light surface, slowly starts chipping away with a very sharp knife, scraping away. If you've ever done that, it doesn't matter what it is, you'll find tiny particles. And so imagine Democritus, by the beach or the agora, wherever he is, with his friends, he's going, check this out. This is amazing. Takes out a sharp knife, begins scraping. Keeps scraping. Little tiny particles come out. He goes, there's your smallest particle. There's your single substance right there. Now, atoms, that's the word we use now, and it does mean uncuttable, but what it meant for Democritus was that those are the smallest, most indivisible pieces. Those tiny little specks make up this piece of rock or cobalt, whatever it is that he's chopping up. So this is a remarkable idea. And again, done without microscopes, done without telescopes, any kind of scientific equipment. But I could imagine Democritus doing something like this, just shaving away at something and showing these tiny particles that come off. So he says that those are the parts that are eternal and unchanging. So remember the vocabulary that we're hearing of these other people that come after Heraclitus and Parmenides, that this is what's unchanging. This is what's eternal. What Democritus also says is that the movement of atoms is of necessity. So these necessarily move. So like Parmenides, the way in which he says that world, that unity, that one, is of necessity. The laws that bind it together and create its limits are of necessity. They must be there. Democritus says the same thing, that these atoms by necessity move in certain ways to create a substance, to create an element. But what is most important is he is able to, again, reconcile Heraclitus and Parmenides. Heraclitus by saying, empirically, can you see these little tiny shavings that are taking off this rock or whatever it is that he's doing? And not only that, there's your empirical part, but he says those little tiny things are eternal and cannot be divided and have always been there and moved by necessity. There's the metaphysical part of it. And that's the Parmenidean view of it. So quite a remarkable idea for someone who had literally no scientific equipment to prove his point. So atoms would combine into different types of matter. Different atoms had different shapes and qualities. Some were larger or smaller, but were still indivisible. Some had hooks or sharp edges. And imagine, just close your eyes for a moment and imagine a game of Tetris, right? And boop, 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 little things fall in different shapes and fill up all the gaps. That's what Democritus was thinking about. And so atoms would combine together because of the different sizes and shapes and the different angles and the different sharpness would come together. And if they perished, they would come together as something else. Imagine seeing, for example, an animal, a carcass of an animal degrade and corrupt and die and just basically rot into the soil. And from there grow plants, right? Grows vegetation, or even cow manure. Cow manure on a vegetable patch, what does it yield? It yields plants. So the atoms dissolve away and become something else. So these ideas were, again, remarkable, bordering on radical, because what Democritus is also saying is that these tiny little aspects, these molecules, are coming together and then dying away, and they combine as something else. But if you are saying that, if they combine as something else, then Democritus is also denying the immortality of the soul. The soul does not remain intact. The soul does not transmigrate somewhere else. It dissolves away, just like everything else. And as a result, he also said that the mind itself was material. Now remember, Parmenides said that we were all part of this globe, this one, this unity. Well, if that's the case, if we all participate in this one, then by rights, logically and reasonably, Democritus would have to argue, yes, if everything perishes, so does the soul and so does the mind. We literally expire. We die away. So for Democritus, two important things: the atoms, and also a clash against Parmenides, the void. Now remember, Parmenides had said, what does not exist cannot be. What does not exist cannot come into being. Well, here's Democritus, again, blowing people's minds by saying there are two things. There is the tiny indivisible atom of different sizes and shapes and so on, but there is the void in which they must move. Because imagine if you could not create a substance, well, you could not create a substance without void. The atoms need to move in some kind of space. So Democritus, for the first time in the history of thought, is basically defining a nothing, an absence, in this case, a void. But he says that void also exists. So people that believe Parmenides is going, what? So what do we do? Well, there it is. So this is all literally within 50 years. A remarkable time in the development of thought. So many different views of the world. So for Democritus, not only is he satisfying Heraclitus, he explains change coming into being and perishing, but he also talks about that single element, maybe not four elements, but one, an atom, but at the same time can satisfy Parmenides by saying, yes, these movements are eternal and they are unchanging. Atoms constantly move, but they move consistently and of necessity. Remember, the structure of the one is built of necessity. So is the movement of atoms. So when atoms approach, they collide with one another, they entangle with each other. That entanglement creates something. But really, all that exists in the world are atoms in the void. So something that exists in a nothing. So as you can imagine, just as people are trying to wrap their heads around the one or fire and change, along comes Democritus and says, okay, here's another one for you. These tiny, tiny things exist in a void because they have to, of necessity. So in a very, very short period of time, there is a whole range of ideas that are presented to the reading public, which at this point, the reading public is very small because the majority of people are still simply reading Homer's Odyssey, and that's how they learn to read this new form of Greek. And Greek was now a new language as of about the 1750s. There was an older version of the Greek language which died away during the Dark Ages in the 1200s, came back around 750 BC, which is why we have all of these individuals, both poets, we've got Homer, Hesiod, writers, philosophers, all kind of hitting the ground running at the same time. So as each one of them presents their ideas, each one now is able to think independently of each other, contradict each other, or in the case of Empedocles, try to reconcile these two tendencies which are around at the particular time that they are writing. So that is, those are the natural philosophers, the pre-Socratics. Hopefully that makes some kind of sense, because even even though those two, Heraclitus and Parmenides, graduate courses have been taught on just one of those two. So it's a lot to digest, but fascinating stuff in trying to reconcile a physical or empirical view of the world and a rational or metaphysical view of why the world is the way it is. Some denying change, some foregrounding change as the only thing that matters.